"Get out of the car, you old black bastard. You look suspicious, and I don't owe you any explanation. Black folks like you are nothing but trouble to this society." The words hissed through Officer Logan Kersey's clenched teeth as his eyes burned with disdain, fixed on the older man in the SUV. He saw Nathaniel Cross as just another weak black man, hurling insults rooted in skin color alone. What Kersey didn't know was that Nathaniel Cross was a retired Lieutenant General of the United States Army, and the very man who would shake the foundations of a police system built on arrogance and contempt. What state are you living in, where the police serve not the people, but power itself? Nathaniel Cross loosened his collar, hands steady on the steering wheel as the SUV rolled along the northern edge of Covell. The vehicle was old, its faded black paint and scratches on the left side enough to draw suspicion, but the steady hum of the engine sounded like the breath of a seasoned machine. Wind blew through the half-lowered window, brushing over his closely cropped silver hair. A military radio broadcast was reporting on a new deployment on the eastern seaboard, the voice distant and steady. A patrol car with Covell County plates appeared behind him just as he turned onto the bridge. At first, it maintained its distance. No siren, no acceleration. Only when Cross signaled and veered toward a gas station did the cruiser suddenly flash its red glow lights and blare its siren. Cross glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression calm. He pulled over and came to a full stop. The patrol car door opened. A tall man with close-cut blonde hair and a police uniform approached. No greeting, no introduction. He stopped at the driver's side window, eyes scanning the dashboard before landing on the neatly folded Class A uniform placed on the passenger seat. "License and registration." His voice was low, curt. Cross retrieved his wallet from the glove compartment and handed over his military ID and driver's license without a word. The officer glanced at them and asked, voice tightening, "Reason for entering town?" "I'm on authorized duty travel," Cross replied, his gaze locked on the officer's face. No follow-up questions. The man returned to his vehicle, then came back minutes later holding a citation and a pen. "Improper lane use, sign here." Cross looked at the paper, then lifted his head, voice steady and low. "Your badge number?" The officer's eyes paused for a moment as if caught off guard by the question. Silence stretched, just long enough to feel off. Then he clenched the citation, yanked the pen from Cross's hand, and stepped back. Cross remained still, hands resting on his thighs. The breeze carried the scent of old, rain-soaked earth into the SUV. He knew the drill, every step committed to memory, but the officer's eyes, when he backed away, no longer looked procedural. They had already made a decision, long before the stop. In the rearview mirror, Cross saw Kersey lift his radio to his mouth, whisper something, then let it drop. He didn't look back. A faint smirk appeared at the corner of his lips. Behind Cross's SUV, tires crunched in the opposite lane. Another unit was arriving, and he understood now this was not just about a ticket. Nathaniel Cross's SUV remained motionless by the roadside, a solid object against the current of the town. Two more cruisers arrived, one parking on each side, forming a wedge. Officers exited, glancing toward him, one pointing at the windshield, another resting a hand near his radio. Inside, the radio had gone silent, leaving only the sound of tires cracking gravel. Logan Kersey walked up, stopping in front of the SUV, hand resting on his holster. His eyes locked on the older man's face, not to inspect, but to condemn. "Get out of the car, old black man. You look suspicious. I don't need to explain myself. Guys like you are nothing but trouble to society," Kersey said, louder than before, ensuring the other units heard him. Cross stayed seated, back straight, his gaze unwavering. He looked out for a moment, then slowly turned. His voice was clear and composed. "I am following a legal duty route. Unless there's a warrant or a specific reason, I am not obligated to exit the vehicle." A stillness settled, as if the world paused. The wind died. In the distance, a truck horn echoed faintly. Kersey frowned and motioned for the two officers beside him to approach. One was young, less than 2 years on the force, according to internal records, fumbling with his handcuffs as he stepped toward the door. The door opened with a soft hiss. Cross stepped out, movement steady, head held high. He didn't resist, didn't flinch. He turned to the officer, voice low and metallic. "Where are your badge numbers?" No answer came. No eye contact. All eyes seemed to look away. Kersey approached and cuffed Cross with sharp precision. As the metal snapped shut, he loudly declared the charge. Obstruction of a law enforcement officer, failure to comply with a lawful order. Cross said nothing. His face remained calm, hands behind his back in a posture reminiscent of a military formation. His dark shirt was tugged at the shoulders, fine dust clinging to his fatigues. A veteran who had endured combat showed no visible rage, but his eyes carried a silence that defied words. Across the street, near a sandwich cart, a middle-aged man pulled out his phone and began recording. No one stopped him. The video contained no shouting, no struggle, just the image of a tall black man, broad-shouldered, hands cuffed behind his back, surrounded by 3 white officers. Cross was escorted to the nearest patrol car. As the door opened, he turned once, not looking at anyone in particular. His gaze seemed to pierce through Kersey, as if recognizing that face from a different time, under a different uniform, wearing the same expression of righteous entitlement. The door closed, and the sound of the lock echoed in the sterile cabin. In the rearview mirror, Cross caught his reflection. Head upright, collar crooked, shirt dusty. His face showed no anger. It was the face of someone who had survived far worse, yet was still rattled by how his own country received a returning soldier. The morning at the Covell County Courthouse passed quietly. Scattered government vehicles occupied the front parking lot, each covered with a fine layer of dust. Pale sunlight filtered through the low-hanging branches, casting shadows on the steps leading into the main hall. The glass doors opened, and Nathaniel Cross entered. His Class A uniform was pressed to precision, collar neatly aligned beneath 2 glinting silver stars. Rows of medals lay orderly on his chest, their metallic sheen subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had served. Cross walked with steady strides, the soles of his polished shoes tapping lightly against the marble floor. His face remained calm, eyes sweeping across the space with the composed air of someone long accustomed to order and discipline. Behind the reception desk, a young clerk looked up as Cross approached. She hesitated briefly before regaining her professional poise, reaching for the summons he handed over. Nearby, a police officer glanced at the ribbons on Cross's chest. Blinking before turning away, there was a flicker of recognition, perhaps from a military report or a name remembered, but no words were exchanged. Cross took the waiting pen and filled out the required form, each letter formed with deliberate precision. His date of birth, rank, and Department of Defense identification code were marked clearly. He carried no briefcase, no legal documents, no phone. Everything he brought was in the uniform worn with deliberate formality, not as a defense, but as a statement. As he entered the courtroom, the rear door trembled slightly from worn hinges. Inside, Logan Kersey was already present. He sat with legs crossed, arms folded, his eyes locked on Cross with a crooked smirk, the expression of someone waiting for his authority to be confirmed. His tan uniform hung unevenly across his shoulder. His nameplate shone but was chipped at the edges. Kersey didn't move as Cross passed, the scorn in his gaze left unchecked. Judge Arnold Whitlow sat at the bench, light from the window behind casting half his face in shadow. Cross met his eyes briefly. Whitlow nodded in silence. His expression was colder than expected, but beneath it was a quiet gravity, shaped by things seen but never spoken. Cross stood at the defense position but did not sit. He remained upright, hands clasped in front of him, back straight. His gaze didn't scan the room, didn't seek reassurance. It held still, fixed on a patch of floor where sunlight slanted across the wooden panels. He didn't adjust his uniform, he didn't move. In a space built to define right and wrong, his stillness stood like a framed portrait, alone but not diminished. His uniform held more than rank. It carried a lifetime of service. And before him was not just an accusation, but a system suddenly unsettled by a silence it could not control. Judge Whitlow adjusted his glasses, scanning the room before speaking. He confirmed Cross's identity and reviewed the main charges. When it came to legal representation, he looked up and asked directly, "Mr. Cross, do "Do you have counsel present?" Cross maintained his stance, replying in a low, steady tone, "No need." Whitlow made a note. On the left, Kersey rose, straightened his tie, and stepped into the witness stand. Under the gaze of the courtroom, he adopted a composed posture, voice measured with practiced rhythm. The defendant resisted from the outset. When asked to exit the vehicle for a violation check, he refused to cooperate and used his military stature to apply pressure. He paused, glancing at Cross with a flicker of restrained pride, then returned his gaze to the judge. "We were forced to take control as the situation began to escalate." The room gave no reaction. Judge Whitlow raised his head and turned to Cross. His tone remained calm. "Do you have anything to say in response to that account?" Cross faced him directly, his expression unchanged. "I did not refuse to cooperate. I asked for his badge number." The words came evenly, not as a protest, not raised in volume, but each one struck with the weight of hammered steel. No one spoke. The clerks froze mid-sentence. The bailiff paused mid-step. Whitlow watched Cross for a long moment before lowering his gaze to the file. He tapped his gavel lightly, once, twice, 3 times. "This hearing will recess to verify records and assess the testimony. Both parties will exit and await further notice for rescheduling." The hallway sounds slipped in as the door opened. Officers and court staff stood from their seats. Kersey turned, avoiding eye contact, but his eyes darted once to Cross, lips pressed, that mocking smile not entirely faded. Cross moved last. He didn't look back, revealing no emotion. His footsteps across the wood were unhurried, yet each one seemed to leave a trace no sound could erase. He walked into the corridor, where light from the high windows stretched across the stone floor like a muted banner. No documents in hand, no escort, no one following but the clerk, who tried to steal one final glance. Yet those footsteps carried something the courtroom had felt deeply, a silence not born of fear, but a defiance heavier than any words, a presence that blunted every argument just made. Judge Whitlow remained seated, gripping his pen. He, too, seemed to sense something cracking quietly between the lines of the case file in front of him. Ariel Torres sat behind her desk on the second floor of the Covell Public Defender's office, her coffee long since gone cold. The day's case list filled her computer screen, names lining up like a lifeless string of numbers. She tapped her fingers against the keyboard, eyes skimming past charges of domestic violence, restraining order violations, petty theft, coerced confessions without legal counsel, all familiar, repetitive, draining cases. When a clerk from the courtroom forwarded a new case, Ariel nearly declined, but out of habit she clicked open the file. The defendant's name was Nathaniel Cross. Charge: obstruction of a law enforcement officer. Status: no legal representation. Refused to provide a detailed statement. Ariel frowned. Her eyes paused at the short description underneath. Retired Army Lieutenant General, arrested during an administrative traffic stop. She picked up her phone, skimming the summary. The system flagged it as a potentially non-compliant individual. In her mind, the image came easily. A stubborn old man, clinging to past glories, now stirring trouble because he was asked to cooperate. There were plenty of veterans who acted like the law didn't apply to them. She muttered under her breath and typed into the notes section, "Difficult to work with, no intent to cooperate, proceed with minimum recommendation." She moved on to other files, ready to dismiss this one. But a few minutes later, her eyes caught a glimpse of Cross's military service data. She hadn't searched for it. It had auto-loaded into the system. His service record spanned over 3 decades, stretching from the Middle East to Africa, with participation in 7 major campaigns. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the rarest honors given to living soldiers, Ariel straightened up. Her professional instinct signaled that something didn't align with the usual rhythm. She quickly checked the disciplinary actions section. It was empty. No violations, no internal complaints, no signs of insubordination. For a man of that rank and length of service, this was extraordinary. She closed her eyes briefly, fingers interlaced. Her legal heart had grown numb after hundreds of unresolved cases, slippery defendants, and stories that blurred into gray. But this time there was a strange stillness in her thoughts. It wasn't admiration or sentiment. It was the fact that the details were too clean to ignore. She stood up, reached for her coat. Her voice echoed in the empty room. "One meeting, If he's what I think, I'll cross him off. Yet, deep down, something had shifted, as if she had stepped into an unmarked turn on a map. And the man behind the name Cross might not be like anyone she had met before. The holding room door shut behind Ariely Torres as she entered. The space was plain, with light-colored walls, a wooden table, and 2 chairs facing each other. Nathaniel Cross sat to the right, leaning back slightly, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on a slanted patch of sunlight on the floor. Ariely spoke first, in professional tone. "I'm Ariely Torres, your court-appointed attorney." Cross nodded without speaking. She paused, waiting for a reaction, then took the seat across from him. He didn't extend a hand, no clear expression. His face remained calm in the same way that had irritated her while reading his file. "Can you tell me what happened that morning?" Her question was clear, not confrontational. Cross glanced at her briefly, then replied in a report-like tone. "Asked to sign a citation I didn't violate. I requested the badge number. Was arrested." Aurelia noted it down, watching him. "Can you clarify why you refused to sign?" "I didn't refuse. I asked for badge verification before confirming the document's legality." For the first time, she felt the conversation slipping beyond her grasp. No emotional cracks to explore. No indirect explanations. No sign of someone needing to be rescued. Cross had built an invisible barrier between himself and her assumptions. "I'm here to help you," she offered, trying to rescue the process she knew too well. "I don't need help," Cross said after a pause, slower this time. "I need the truth to be properly recorded." Ariel froze. A small fracture split through the defense she had relied on to keep professional distance. In that room, she was no longer the sole one asking questions. Cross wasn't trying to take control. He simply made her feel like she no longer had it. As she left the room, Ariely didn't return to her office right away. She paused in the hallway, reopened the electronic file, and scrolled to the evidence section. The body cam footage was missing. A note beside it read, "Unable to retrieve. Software malfunction." It wasn't unfamiliar. She had seen it in smaller cases where technical oversights conveniently erased facts, but this time it made her throat tighten. A tingling sensation spread from her chest to her temples, as if something had been deliberately hidden. Back at her desk, Ariel opened her laptop. She created a new folder, typing slowly, "Cross inconsistencies." Into it, she pasted a screenshot of the technical error message, a summary of Cross's file, and a snippet of federal law mandating badge identification transparency. The screen went black as her fingers left the keyboard. Reflected in the dark monitor was her own image, not that of a tired public defender finishing another case, but of a woman realizing for the first time some cases aren't meant to be closed. Some exist to force us to re-examine how we live each day. Late in the afternoon, Ariely Torres sat before her computer screen, the light from a small window casting a soft glow on her cheek. She was reviewing the case files in preparation for the second hearing in the Cross case. The litigation database system displayed a list of personnel, and the name Logan Kersey stood out in the assignment column. She hovered the mouse over his name, a habitual reflex. Tooltip appeared. Internal disciplinary report processed. There was no attached file, only a lock icon, and the note, "Internal access restricted, document unverified." Ariel frowned slightly. Most restricted files fell into 2 categories: unverified documentation or records sealed for internal procedural adjustments. Still, she clicked on it. A temporary PDF opened in a pop-up window, cached from the internal system. The quality was poor, the font outdated, but the content was legible. It listed 3 incidents over the past 5 years, 2 complaints from elderly residents about verbal harassment during neighborhood patrols, 1 suspicious vehicle search involving 2 Asian teenagers on their way home from a school festival, and finally, a proposed temporary suspension submitted by a supervisory inspector without a clear explanation, concluding only with the phrase, "No action taken," due to insufficient evidence and lack of severity. Ariel leaned in, tapping the spacebar. She reread the brief descriptions, trying to identify what felt off. Each incident was presented briefly with no footnotes, no disciplinary outcomes aside from the phrase, "archive." None of these entries had ever appeared in any public summary or report she'd read. More importantly, none were mentioned in the litigation documents for Cross's case. She exited the preview and opened a separate folder reserved for anomalous cases, noting, Kersey compressed internal file. Retrieve full complaint history to assess behavioral patterns prior to hearing 2. Her eyes lingered on the screen. A strange feeling crept in. Unclear whether it was professional instinct or something closer to alarm. She opened an automated query form, typing, Officer Logan Kersey, complete internal conduct record, past 7 years. She selected private mode, allowing the system to send the request anonymously to internal servers, creating a digital footprint that wouldn't appear externally. After submitting the request, Ariel closed the window and returned to handling a routine case involving shoplifting at a convenience store. The administrative flow continued as usual, one dry data entry after another without warning signs, until the system clock blinked, internal message received. She opened her inbox and found an untitled message from an unknown user ID. The body was blank, but it included a video file over 100 MB in MP4 format. No message, no timestamp, no words. A chill ran down her spine as the cursor hovered over the icon. Deep within, an old instinct stirred. Someone had sent her a fragment the system did not want to retain. Ariel drew the curtain shut before clicking the video. The screen went dark for a moment, then revealed a shaky frame. The angle filmed from the right side of the person wearing the device, a familiar body cam format. The video lasted just over a minute, but from the first second, her heartbeat slowed uncomfortably. Kersey stood directly in front of the camera, facing Cross. His voice snapped like a line rehearsed for a report. Cross wore a gray shirt and dark khaki pants, left hand resting on the car, back straight, eyes fixed on Kersey. His voice came through clearly. Your badge number? No sarcasm, no defiance. Just a question delivered with a firm, even tone, as if pulled straight from a protocol manual. Kersey gave no reply. He lowered his voice, drew the cuffs from behind his belt, and stepped toward Cross. The video jolted as the officer wearing the camera shifted slightly. The angle skewed but still captured Kersey grabbing Cross's arm. Cross did not step back. His body leaned slightly to maintain balance, the other hand remaining on the vehicle. No resistance, no twisting, no struggle. Kersey's voice rang out. Step back. You are obstructing a law enforcement officer. The cuffs clicked open. The camera view shifted again. When it settled, Cross was cuffed with his hands behind his back, his gaze not directed at Kersey, but slightly angled toward the camera. In the final second of the footage, a whisper came through, so close to the mic that it sounded painfully clear. This will never be reviewed. Ariel sat motionless, hand on the trackpad, unmoving. Everything within that minute contradicted the official report Kersey had filed. There was no resistance, no behavior justifying the use of force, and that final line, spoken without caution, was a devastating confirmation of what she had long suspected. The evidence existed, it just wasn't in the official file. She opened the file's metadata. A name appeared, Recorder C. Hall. It matched Curtis Hall, a reserve officer listed as present at the scene in the original roster. His administrative status now showed on leave. No reason, no return date. Ariel reopened her email, searching through old internal threads until she found a personal address, once used in group chats. curtisshaw.47@civicmail.org. The account had been deleted from the system 3 days earlier. She typed a single line, no subject, I want to meet you. Then she hit send. Something inside her had shifted, out of alignment. For 2 years, she had processed cases like a neutral processor. No emotion, no personal stake. But now, she knew she was no longer impartial. Not for Cross, not for military honor. But if she stayed silent, she too would be part of the dust being swept over the bloodstains. She plugged in an external hard drive. The video was copied, lightly encrypted, and saved under the name Fragment 1. It would never enter the court's system. It would not be mentioned in technical logs. But it existed. As she turned off the screen, Arielle sat still for a moment in the darkening room, her eyes locked on the wall where her first law degree hung. Perhaps this was the first thing she had ever done that wasn't guided by law, but urged forward by conscience. After her brief meeting with Nathaniel Cross, Ariel Torres returned to her office, uncertain of what she truly wanted. She reopened the case file and scrolled to the section marked Digital Evidence in light gray. The final line made her pause. Primary body cam device, software error, data not saved. The wording was neat, procedural, yet a chill crept down her spine. Ariel had seen many such statements before and knew the truth often existed outside any system. But this time, the accused's background wouldn't let her dismiss the unease building inside. A lieutenant general with an almost spotless record, pulled over and handcuffed over a vague exchange, and now a faulty camera? She sent an email to the archive tech department but received an automated reply. The technician was on a 7-day leave. Ariel didn't wait. She grabbed her bag and headed to the technical floor at the back of the administrative building. At the auxiliary desk, a thin young man with slightly hunched shoulders was entering inventory into the system. "You're Curtis Hall, right?" He looked up, briefly surprised, then nodded. Ariel gave him the file code, requesting a full check of all camera data related to Cross's case. Curtis typed a few lines, leaned closer, and his voice softened as a red warning message appeared. Primary device, data error. Cause unverified. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a USB drive wrapped in shock-resistant casing. His eyes held a hint of caution, but also something else, quiet defiance. "I'm not sure how long this will exist. It's a backup from the secondary device worn by the support officer. I haven't uploaded it to the system and no one requested it, but you should see it." Ariel took the USB without changing her expression, though inside her mind was churning. "Have you shared this with anyone else?" Curtis shook his head. She nodded and left the tech area without another word. Back in her office, Ariel locked the door, drew the blinds, and placed her phone in a drawer. She plugged the USB into her laptop, waited a few seconds until a folder appeared with an unmarked file format. She opened it. The video began with a static frame. The SUV parked roadside, Cross sitting inside, his face as still as stone. Kersey entered the frame from the right, his voice curt through the body cam speaker. The dialogue was brief. When Cross asked, "Badge number, Sergeant," the image remained stable. No glitches. In the next second, Kersey turned and gestured behind him. Another figure approached the vehicle. No one answered the question. No force, no resistance. Cross stepped out as requested, calm and composed. He repeated the question. This time he looked directly at Kersey. The officer's face stiffened for a moment, then turned away and motioned for the cuffs. Ariel sat still, hands on the mouse and knees, eyes locked on the screen. The frame froze on Cross, handcuffed, standing in the street, his gaze focused on something no camera could fully capture. Her heart beat deep and slow. Outside, daylight remained, but in that small room, the screen's glow was the only light separating bureaucratic narrative from truth unapproved for broadcast. She remained motionless, eyes on the final frame. Nathaniel Cross's face was clear in the daylight, his eyes showing no fear, no plea, just a cold reminder that truth doesn't need to scream. She rewound the footage, slower this time. Every movement, every pause was scrutinized like a legal analysis. She paid attention to the gaps between lines. Kersey didn't ask further questions, gave no explanation, and didn't read any right. Cross stayed still, showing no resistance. When he exited, his steps were steady, shoulders level, neck upright. The same question was asked twice. "Badge number, Sergeant?" No change in tone, no raised voice, no abruptness. Yet that question alone triggered a man's arrest in public view. On her third watch, Ariel paused on Kersey's expression. The moment Cross repeated the question, his eye twitched, his lips tightened. Gaze briefly shifted. It reminded her of incidents where body cams malfunctioned just when a witness needed exoneration. But this time the image was too clear, too complete, too at odds with what was in the official report. Ariel pulled up Kersey's formal statement. The subject exhibited agitated behavior, raised his voice, made unreasonable demands, leveraged military status to exert pressure, refused to exit the vehicle, and appeared to reach for an unknown object from his back pocket. Every line read like it had passed through a legal filter, but nothing in the footage matched. The sensation of falling through her trust in the legal process hit her hard. She once believed that everything recorded would be verified. that statements couldn't lie when evidence followed, but the real world rarely aligned that way. For the first time, she felt pulled from the safety of case files and codes. Before her was the unembellished truth, needing no addendum, no labels. A man charged simply for asking the right question in the wrong context. Ariel printed a frame from the video. It captured the moment Cross finished his question, his gaze meeting the camera for a single second before shifting to Kelsey's shoulder. No threat, no challenge, no surprise. Just the look of someone used to being ignored. She placed the photo next to the thick file among countless other cases. She stared at it longer than usual. What she felt wasn't outrage but clarity. She didn't yet know who deleted the footage, or how a false report made it into the official file without objection. But she knew one thing: this case wouldn't close like any other administrative record. Ariel flipped open the file and wrote the first handwritten note since the case began. The most terrifying silence is the one they try to erase from the camera. The sound of the gavel echoed again as Judge Whitlow announced the hearing would resume. The courtroom felt heavier than in the morning, as if each testimony had seeped into the wooden ceiling, collecting in the scratches across the table's surface. Whitlow turned to the final page in the police report, narrowing his eyes at the brief summary. He looked up, his voice low and firm, addressing the man standing at the center of the room. Mr. Cross, according to the officer's statements, you were uncooperative during the administrative inspection. Do you confirm this? Cross slowly turned his head, gaze steady and unflinching. He answered firmly, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. I request a 5-minute recess. I need to make a call under personal authority. A wave of silence crashed over the room. No one reacted in time. Whitlow placed his pen down, brow furrowed, fingers tapping the chair arm, weighing the phrasing Cross had just used. After a moment, he nodded. 5 minutes? You may use the courtroom. Ariel leaned slightly, her hands tightening in her lap. She had never seen a defendant request a recess mid-section and be granted one, especially not in a case labeled as obstruction of law enforcement. Cross reached inside his jacket, pulling out a dark gray device, slim, with a laser-etched metallic surface dulled by time. A federal seal glinted in one corner next to a string of silver digital identification codes. Under the fluorescent lights, the device caught a few sideways glances. An older officer near the back tilted his head, his eyes reflecting a cautious recognition. Kersey scoffed. He squinted at the device as if watching an old trick being recycled. In his mind, the notion of high authority held no weight in Koval, where he knew every corner and every name that could sway an internal report. Ariel, however, remained still. She had seen that type of device only once, during a preliminary hearing for a Homeland Security agent at the Southern Division. That kind of clearance wasn't granted to retirees unless they were still active as federal consultants, interagency liaisons, or under direct orders from the Department of Defense. Cross walked toward the end of the room, where light from the high window cast narrow beams across the floor. With his back to the courtroom, he raised the device to his ear and quickly entered a series of numbers. His frame stayed perfectly still, like carved stone, but the reflection in the window revealed something else. Eyes connecting to a place no one else in the room could reach. No one heard what he said. There was no narration, no repetition, no expression other than a single deep breath as he ended the call. In that moment, his gaze no longer belonged to a man on trial. It belonged to someone accustomed to confidential briefings, to decisions never recorded in public transcripts. When he turned back, he gently clenched the device and slid it into his inner jacket pocket. A simple motion, yet it drew a chill over the room. Kersey stared at him for a few seconds, suspicion swallowed by something bigger than he'd anticipated. Ariel kept her eyes on Cross, unmoving. Cross said nothing more. He returned to his place, posture unshaken, but his gaze deeper, heavier, like someone who had just sent a signal the entire system would be forced to reckon with, even if no one knew what it was. Yet everyone felt it. That silence had changed the course of the trial. Whitlow stopped writing. The pen tip touched the edge of the file but didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on Cross, sharper than in any previous exchange. A man had just made a call no one heard. No one could verify, yet it had frozen the room. Something in the way he stood, calm amid dozens of stares, disrupted the air itself. Ariel felt her spine stiffen. She shifted slightly, observing Cross with new distance, not between lawyer and client, but something else in that moment. He no longer resembled a man in need of defense. She tracked each movement, how he stored the device, how he stood with timeless poise, his breathing steady as if time no longer applied. Her fingers tapped her notepad as she scribbled. Call requires federal trace? Kersey leaned toward the court clerk and whispered something. He glanced at Cross, then whispered again. Finally, he growled, "Do we have the right to inspect that device?" The clerk fumbled for an answer, but Whitlow waved his hand firmly and replied, voice deeper now, "The item is a permitted personal device. Per the record, he is still registered under Military Coordination Code A clearance." A ripple passed through the room. Those familiar with security or law enforcement understood. Code A wasn't issued to retirees, unless for emergency-level federal connections. Arielle glanced around. At the back, a woman in an administrative uniform discreetly raised her phone and snapped a photo of Cross's stance. Perhaps even she didn't know why she felt compelled to do it. On the bench, Whitlow opened the appendix of Cross's file, a section he hadn't touched, assuming this was a routine case. On the 6th page, he found a faint line at the bottom, direct liaison, code A72, pen-fed, routed via defense channel. The line was small, meant to be skimmed over and forgotten, but he didn't. A 72 pen-fed was rare. He had heard it only once, during a federal interagency meeting concerning a police department's procedural violation against a military unit. At that time, a single call had forced the entire federal command to halt all approvals and re-audit civilian intake protocols. Whitlow looked up from the file and stared at Cross for a long time. In that moment, he understood. This wasn't someone pretending to hold authority. This was a man who had remained silent long enough for people to forget he had the right to speak. Cross stood at the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes didn't settle on anyone. They moved through walls, through the names in the docket, through every face in the gallery. He no longer bore the image of a defendant. In his stance, Cross became a quiet axis, forcing everyone to reconsider their position within a system they thought they knew. The hearing continued, but the atmosphere shifted. The clerk's voice faltered. Kersey's hand trembled slightly as he turned the next report. What had once seemed certain now faded in the presence of something that needed no explanation. From that moment on, no one saw Cross as a man on trial. He became a rupture, revealing cracks in a structure built on top-down control. And perhaps for the first time in that room, everyone understood the call had not been made to ask for help, it had been a signal, and the system had received it. The noise in the courthouse hallway faded as Arielle focused on the laptop screen resting on her lap. She had replayed the body cam footage 3 times. Pausing at the moment, Cross tilted his head and calmly asked, "Badge number, Sergeant?" Kersey's brow furrowed slightly. Then came the signal to handcuff. There was no threat, no inflammatory language, not a single act of resistance. Across the hall, Kersey paced, gripping his phone tightly, his voice sharp and mixed with heavy breaths. He kept glancing toward Arielle, as if trying to guess how much she already knew. Fragmented phrases like, "If this goes public, we're all screwed," leaked out from the conversation he was clearly trying to keep concealed. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, drawing all eyes in one direction. 3 soldiers in dress uniform walked in, medals glinting under the cold fluorescent lights. Leading them was an older man, tall, dark-skinned, bearing the insignia of a 2-star general. His stride was firm and deliberate, face unreadable but decisive. Each step seemed to draw a line between military protocol and civilian authority, between silence and resistance. A court officer stepped out awkwardly and asked in a hushed voice, "Do you have an appointment, sir?" The man replied with a deep, resonant tone, "No, I'm Colonel Marcus Langley. Under orders from the Department of Defense, I am authorized to attend this hearing to represent an officer on active duty." The clerk's face turned pale as he picked up the phone to alert the courtroom. Meanwhile, Ariel stood up sharply. She had come across Langley's name in an Eastern Theater military campaign report, a man rarely seen by the press, known for his cold resolve in defending military honor. Langley approached the reception desk and handed over a sealed folder. The red seal of the Pentagon and a federal authorization code marked its cover. "This is the mission certification for Lieutenant General Nathaniel Cross. Any interference during his duty is a federal violation." A heavy silence settled over the hallway. Everything seemed to pause. Curtis stepped forward quietly from the back, his eyes briefly meeting Ariel's. Everyone seemed to sense it. This moment would change the lens through which the entire case was seen. Langley did not stop at delivering documents. He stood tall, scanning every face in the courthouse vicinity. When someone asked why he had come in person, he answered without hesitation, "We came to defend something you appear to have forgotten. Federal orders are still law, and the law is not optional." As the file was passed into the courtroom, Ariel watched the door close behind it. Eyes from clerks, officers, and legal advisors turned to each other, all unspoken, yet aligned by one question. But one person had yet to speak, the man who held authority over the outcome. Whitlow remained silent. The room hushed further as the thick folder was placed on the dark wood desk before him. In that silence, the atmosphere grew heavier than any hearing Ariel had witnessed. The Pentagon-stamped file lay neatly on the table. Judge Arnold Whitlow sat upright, hands clasped at his abdomen, before separating them to flip open the first page. Light from the window highlighted the whiteness of his hair against the stillness of the room. Each page turned soundlessly. His eyes scanned the lines with a practiced calm, expression unchanged, a man who had learned to conceal emotions after hundreds of trials. Langley didn't move, his gaze fixed on Whitlow's every motion. Ariel sat nearby, gripping the edge of the table, eyes shifting between the judge and the file. Kersey stood farther back, stiff and visibly avoiding eye contact. No one spoke. The silence was almost physical, weighing down on the room. The file concluded with a final confirmation. General Nathaniel Cross's movement order was federally classified as an emergency, bearing the direct commanding officer's signature and a special encrypted seal for sensitive assignments. Any interference fell under violation of military executive authority under Defense Code 14-3cc. Whitlow closed the folder and leaned slightly back in his chair, his eyes fixing on an undefined point in front of him. No one could guess what he was thinking. No one dared break the silence. Langley leaned forward, his voice deep and clear. "My officer was detained without proper authority. We request a formal review of the arrest's legality, and if necessary, we will escalate this directly to the Department of Justice." Whitlow raised his head. He neither defended nor agreed. His voice was steady and deliberate. "The court will require additional time to verify the full arrest procedure and assess jurisdiction across all parties. Before issuing any ruling, I must ensure every fact is accurate and unaffected by external pressure." Another silence fell. Langley studied him for a long moment, as if evaluating something deeper than words. Finally, he nodded slightly, but just before turning to leave, he said, only loud enough to be heard at the bench, "Not all silence is harmless, sir." He turned and walked out, followed by the two uniformed officers. As the door opened, a young soldier in the group turned slightly toward Rio. His eyes remained on the polished stone floor, and he spoke, almost like a private reminder, "They're waiting for a mistake. We're trying to reclaim honor." Ariel stood still, offering no reply. She picked up the copy of Langley's file, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table. No one called for the next hearing. No names were read, no case opened. The courtroom hovered in a space between forces, one delaying time, the other demanding it to speed. She left her seat and stepped into the hallway. The courtroom door remained closed behind her. In her hand was a document powerful enough to turn the entire case on its head. But for now, Ariel was no longer focused on the verdict. What lingered was a thought that had never made its way into any written ruling. Sometimes The law isn't bent. It's postponed because people fear its straightness. The internal bulletin of the Covell Police Department was updated early in the morning. Amid routine notes about patrol shifts and vehicle inspection schedules, a small section bore the title, "Officer Suspended." The name listed was Curtis Hall. Reason: violation of video equipment handling protocol. The final line was printed in bold. Appeal rights not granted. Ariel read the notice on her phone while standing in the courthouse elevator. A chill tightened along her spine. Curtis had given no warning, and now his name appeared as if erased from the system without explanation. In the hallway leading to the courtroom, familiar colleagues suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. Some turned away when they saw her from afar. Others offered a nod before quickly moving on. It wasn't indifference that clouded her steps. It was avoidance, programmed and intentional. By noon, Ariella received an email from the Office of Legal Ethics Review. Its subject line read, "Case Audit." The content was brief, stating that preliminary evidence suggested she had accessed and used information outside her designated case scope. She was instructed to submit a personal report within 48 hours. She read the lines slowly, then sat in silence before the screen. They had traced her activity. Every time she opened Kersey's files, touched a hidden record, entered a query into the internal system, all of it had been logged, even though she believed she had covered her tracks. Each action was a footprint left in the snow, now being used to map a path someone else intended for her. She sent 3 emails to Kersey. None were answered. She tried calling Kersey. His number was disconnected. Messages through the internal network went unanswered. A slow chill spread through her chest. She began to wonder if the video from that night was the reason Curtis had been cut out of the system, and if that was true, she feared the next target might be her. Ariel opened her hard drive, pulled the video file from the main server, and transferred it to an external device, encrypting it with private software. She reset the password, renamed the file, and changed its format. The backup was fully disconnected from all networks, and she hid the drive inside a spare key box tucked in a drawer. Returning to her office after a preliminary hearing, she found a thin envelope on her desk. No sender, no logo or postage. She tore it open and pulled out a printed page. It was a transcript of an old speech by Lieutenant General Nathaniel Cross at a defense summit. One sentence near the end was underlined in red ink. Silence for the sake of stability or for the sake of fear. He held the paper for a long time. There was no direct threat, but every word felt deliberately chosen to stir the exact tension she had been wrestling with. Ariel didn't know who had sent it, or whether it was a warning, a reminder, or a subtle test. What she did know was that this system was not neutral. It didn't use bullets. It used silence to push people out of the circle, make them feel like exceptions, and then quietly erase them from the administrative map. And now she had stepped one foot outside that circle, not because she wanted to, but because what she had seen no longer allowed her to return as before. The mailbox in front of Nathaniel Cross's wooden house sat under the shade of dense oak branches, its faded paint exposing long, unattended scratches. That morning, among flyers and routine bills, was a worn ivory envelope, unsigned and unstamped, heavy paper, carefully folded edges, unsealed. Cross stepped into the house, placed the grocery bag on the table, and opened the letter in silence. The folded sheet bore typewriter ink, words aligned at the center like a whispered sentence of judgment. No one can save you from the game you once stayed silent within. He read it again, then folded it quietly. No anger, no panic, just a quiet admission that the past had not retreated from the front line. This letter didn't threaten or insult him directly, but it arrived at just the right moment to resurface something he thought had been buried deep under years of service. The helplessness of being held accountable for a wrong he didn't commit, yet was forced to swallow. He opened the old drawer beside his desk and pulled out a rusted key looped with a red cord. The steel cabinet groaned slightly as he turned the lock. Inside was a pale brown folder, military issue, stamped in red, Special Operation Deployment Code 78D, authorized by the United Defense Agency. It was the official deployment order he had carried the day he was arrested, a document he had never shown in court, trusting that truth would defend itself. Cross picked up his landline, flipped through his old contact book, and dialed a number at the Department of Defense. No small talk. On the other end, a young voice responded, suspicious at first, then increasingly serious as he recited his military ID and authentication code. He requested verification of the mission's validity, demanded a public file be created, and asked that a certified copy be sent to the Covell County Courthouse. Before hanging up, Cross paused and asked, "Do you believe that sometimes the right thing must be proven through silence?" There was no immediate reply. The silence that followed sounded like a slow, heavy nod. Cross didn't wait. He hung up and sat back at his desk, still holding the small key. Evening light streamed through the blinds, casting a glow on the map pinned to his wall, marks showing the places he had served. From Kandahar's desert to Liberia's mangrove swamps, each pin preserved a memory, not for glory, but for witness. His eyes turned to the backyard where wild grass had grown up to his shins. No one knew what he was doing, no one asked, but in his mind links were reconnecting, not to prove his innocence, but to break the silence that had become armor for those who lived in the shadows. When he returned the file to the cabinet, locked it, and stored the key, his hand no longer trembled. Something had begun to shift, and this time, he wasn't doing it to defend himself. He was doing it to force those hiding to step into the light. In the cold office on the south side of the Covell County Courthouse, Ariel Torres opened the interface to access the document revision history, her eyes fixed on 3 red hollowed entries, all updated within hours of each other, each within the first 24 hours after Cross's arrest. The first came from Logan Kersey's account, a preliminary report, vague and lacking detail. The second was added from an unidentified internal code, inserting phrases like showed signs of resistance and unreasonable demands, though still without a sufficient legal basis for charges. The third entry made her pause. It was clear, assertive, stamped by the court, declaring the defendant refused to exit the vehicle, used threatening language, and exerted pressure based on military status. None of the 3 edits had accompanying legal annotations or documentation, as required by procedural standards. She leaned back in her chair, her hand still on the computer mouse. An officer of Kersey's rank couldn't have the clearance to alter files directly in the Federal Judicial Archive, let alone edit them 3 times without triggering procedural logs. The issue was no longer about the accuracy of the content, but about how it was legally allowed to exist. Ariel entered the courtroom holding a motion in hand. She requested a closed hearing, citing Regulation 22.1 regarding the verification of legal alterations in criminal records during preliminary proceeding. Judge Whitlow scanned the document, then looked up at her, his eyes measuring her resolve. Ariel didn't flinch or lower her gaze. She knew this moment would determine whether the system was willing to look at itself. Cross sat behind her, his face carved by a silence no longer defensive but turned to stone. When Whitlow invited him to speak, he simply shook his head. Not a refusal, not an acceptance, just a gesture wrapped in complete distrust. Whitlow closed the folder and placed it on the bench. He inhaled slowly, then announced, "The court will convene a closed hearing, as requested by Counsel Torres. Attendees will include court representatives, state administrative officials, and the petitioner. The doors closed behind those not summoned. The press was ushered out. Courthouse security stood in the hallway. No more watching eyes, no more recording devices. Inside remained only the quiet of people who had reached the threshold where the system began to resist being observed. Arieli understood that if there was any place where truth was stopped before becoming evidence, it was in the internal corridors of power, and right now, That door had been opened by a seemingly benign document revision. In reality, it was the first incision into a system too accustomed to being trusted without scrutiny. In the small room reserved for closed hearings, overhead lights cast a pale glow over a dark wood conference table. All related documents were arranged into 3 labeled and sealed stacks. Judge Whitlow opened the central file, flipping through the first page with deliberate solemnity, as if reminding everyone that this was no longer a debate of right or wrong, but a reckoning with the foundation of trust itself. Clause 27B, he began, voice low and steady, requires that all edits to criminal records before entering the state judicial system must include a report, timestamp, and the identity of the handler, no exceptions. He paused, tapping on the 3rd revision, where the words threat, refusal, and leveraging status had first appeared. That data entry had shifted the case from a civil infraction to a criminal investigation. At the end of the table, a systems technician presented the IP tracking results. The final edit was made from a device tagged TJC417, registered under the Administrative Coordination Office. He opened his laptop, projecting a network diagram onto the wall screen. And that device is located in the private office of Mr. Thomas Eldred. The name drew everyone's eyes to Arielle. She wasn't surprised. She had suspected as much, but hearing the system confirm it still made her chest tighten. Eldred didn't appear in any records, yet ran operations from behind the scenes, a quiet figure, once the right hand of Richard Kearse, Logan's father, during a state council re-election campaign nearly a decade ago. Judge Whitlow turned to the authorization document Eldred had once signed, granting emergency access to the system under sensitive circumstances requiring pre-review. The document was legal, but its usage had never been audited. Whitlow closed the file, his eyes shadowed, full of weight. In that moment, his expression no longer resembled a judge's. It was that of a man realizing the institution he trusted had begun to rot from within. He looked toward Cross, who sat at the far end of the table, hands folded on his lap, eyes steady. Whitlow meant to speak, to ask why Cross had chosen silence throughout the proceedings, why he hadn't defended himself when given the chance. But he stopped. That gaze had answered already. It was the look of someone who had sat through other hearings, where words changed nothing, where silence became the last thing that preserved dignity. No one spoke further. The hearing ended with a nod from Whitlow. He ordered an internal investigation and a full audit of administrative access logs over the past 3 months. There was no applause, no protest, but as the attendees rose and filed out of the room, one truth became clearer than any ruling. A fracture had appeared, slow but real, right in the heart of what once seemed unshakable, and through that fracture, the system began to hear its own echo. Langley entered the office with a straight-back stride, his uniform crisp without a single crease. He placed the briefcase on the desk in front of Arielle and nodded in place of a greeting. His face revealed little, but his eyes made it clear this meeting would not follow protocol. Arielle waited for him to sit before speaking, her tone composed. "I take it there's something you couldn't send by email?" Langley opened the briefcase, removed a thick file with a silver-blue cover and a broken seal, and slid it across the desk. Some things don't belong in the system for too long. Under the desk lamp, Arielle opened the file. The first page was stamped, "Internal, not for release." Just below, the report's title read, Operation Gavel Spear, El Rashid region, June, 12 years ago. It described an American platoon accused of using live ammunition on civilians following an unidentified roadside explosion. She turned to the second page. The original report was detailed, with diagrams and tactical simulations. At the end was a signature field for the commanding officer, the name listed, Nathaniel Cross, then deputy commander of the operation. Just below the blank line, a handwritten note in slanted blue ink read, "I do not rewrite the truth so others can sleep easier." Arielle paused for several seconds. Her hand rested gently on the page, touching the words as though reaching into the quietest part of a voice long excluded from the official record. Langley remained silent while she read. When she looked up, he spoke in an even tone. He made no statements, no press releases, no formal complaints. He just refused. And by doing that, he removed himself from the promotion list. No ban, no official order. O'Reilly flipped to the next year's performance review. In the comments section, technically solid leader, but lacks adaptability in political environments. The sentence had been underlined in red ink. The final reviewer was a retired deputy defense secretary. Langley leaned forward, his voice dropping. From that moment on, they knew he'd never be someone they could control. And they did what systems always do. They blurred him out, reassigned to units with no strategic influence, reduced media access, and kept his name off every leadership shortlist. They didn't eliminate him. They erased him from the light. Ariel leaned back in her chair. The file remained open, Cross's handwriting clearly visible. She didn't ask further questions. Everything she needed to understand had already been laid bare. Cross wasn't punished for dissent. He didn't lash out, didn't yell, didn't draw attention. He simply remained silent when it mattered, and that silence was what unsettled those at the top. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a refusal to participate in a lie, the kind of act that makes a system lose control of its narrative. She closed the file, but the phrase echoed like a drumbeat in her head. I do not rewrite the truth so others can sleep easier. It wasn't an excuse. It was a reverse indictment, aimed at those who survive by covering everything they've chosen to ignore with a coat of whitewash. Ariel stood by the office window, the afternoon light stretching her silhouette across the wall behind her. In front of her, the file remained open, Cross's words etched into her mind. She didn't think about legal statutes or past cases she had handled. What returned to her was his gaze. Throughout every hearing, it had never wavered. Cross had never objected, never raised his voice, never pleaded, and because of that he made those around him uneasy, then wary, then quietly afraid. Langley had said that morning, "Most people think the system fears the loud ones. The truth is, it fears those who stay calm while standing upright after being broken." That sentence kept ringing in her mind, like a note scribbled in the margins of her understanding. Cross didn't need to react. He was the anomaly. In a machinery that runs on orders, obedience, and fear of losing position, he chose silence. But that silence wasn't empty. It carried a message that forced the most powerful to prepare contingency plans. Ariel pulled the chair closer and reopened the file to the final section. Among the attached documents was a pale memorandum titled Risk Assessment, Uncontrolled Information Exposure Potential, subject Nathaniel Cross. It was dated 6 months earlier and had been sent from the Office of Interagency Coordination at the Department of Defense to the Legal Division of the Department of Justice. She read line by line, eyes unmoving. The memo warned that if Cross engaged with the public as a credible military witness, it could trigger a cascade beyond media containment, especially in regions with a history of distrust toward law enforcement. The term used wasn't threat or violation, it was the potential to generate unforeseen social response. Ariel's hand trembled slightly on the desk. The memo wasn't written by local police. It bore initials from the highest offices in the Pentagon. What shook her more was that Cross's arrest in Cavell occurred precisely during his training assignment in that state. His travel schedule was encrypted, yet somehow it had aligned perfectly with the moment Kersey intercepted him. She closed the file, hands clasped behind her neck. The question she had carried from the start of the case had once been simple. Was Cross wrongfully detained? That question was gone now. In its place stood another, deeper and colder. Who had seen him as a threat long before he ever spoke? A system built like steel, believed to be untouchable, still harbors gaps too dangerous to name. And within that void live those who become silent fractures, not enough to collapse the structure, but enough to make each layer tremble. Cross was one of them. No fists, no shouting, just standing still. And that alone was enough to shake the pillars of long-entrenched authority. Ariel looked around the room. Everything remained still, but inside her, the understanding of what they called order had begun to crack. slow, irreversible, and loud in its quiet. Morning light streamed through the window pane, casting a slanted glow on the worn edges of the dark wooden desk. Judge Arnold Whitlow sat behind the sheer curtain, fingers interlaced, eyes not fixed on any file in front of him, but on something more distant, an old photograph on the wall. In the picture, he stood upright, stern-faced in an Army engineer uniform, the dusty red backdrop of a field camp stretching behind him. Few people knew he had once been a soldier. Fewer remembered that he had nearly died in the hills of Kandahar, where a homemade explosive lodged shrapnel into his leg during a minefield clearance. The officer who locked down the site and called in the support team wasn't just anyone. It was Lieutenant Nathaniel Cross, then a rear support commander. They never spoke after that. They didn't need to. A leader who brings his men home intact deserves respect, not in words, but in memory. Whitlow returned, studied law, and climbed the ranks of the justice system. His uniform had long been folded and put away, but that gaze from back then, those eyes, had never left him. So when the file bearing Cross's name landed on his desk, he knew he wouldn't sleep soundly without reading every line. 2 files lay on the desk. One was a detailed incident report on Cross, labeled non-compliant, refused lawful orders. The other, thicker one, outlined contributions to Whitlow's upcoming re-election campaign, including the name of George Kersey, Logan Kersey's father, who had twice helped him survive critical fundraising slumps. His company was currently bidding on contracts to build new detention facilities for the county. One move could erase every remaining political chance Whitlow had. He knew Cross didn't need his protection. A man like that didn't ask to be defended. He needed to be judged fairly. And precisely because of that, the decision became exponentially harder. Between the man who once pulled him out of a foxhole and the one holding the keys to his present power, the real distance wasn't measured in paperwork. It lived deep within himself. He opened the left drawer and pulled out an old plastic card. Its navy blue surface was faded, the edges warped, and at the bottom right corner remained a faint brown stain. Blood from his leg that day, something he had never let anyone clean off. He held it for a long time, fingertips pressing lightly, then placed it back in the drawer, as if laying down a piece of memory that still held warmth. The sound of paper flipping echoed as he closed the first file. His eyes landed on the name Cross. Nathaniel Major General. He exhaled, not in relief, but as if releasing a question that had trapped him all night. What he needed to answer now was no longer about right or wrong, victory or defeat, career or support. The question came into full clarity, sharp as a blade. If I stay silent, who am I then? Courtroom 3 was silent, sunlight from the high window casting a streak over the frayed wooden benches. Nathaniel Cross sat upright, shoulders squared, hands resting on his lap. On his Class A uniform, the service ribbons didn't gleam, but carried the heavy weight of years no courtroom could ever quantify. Logan Kersey sat across from him, leaning back in his seat, eyes darting between the gallery and the man before him. He wore a pristine patrol uniform, the large gold badge gleaming on his chest. Whitlow's footsteps echoed evenly as he entered the courtroom. A thick file was tucked under one arm, the spine slightly bent from a night under pressure. He didn't rush to sit, but scanned both sides briefly. No need for long statements, no need to reiterate charges. His voice rang out, deep and steady. Officer Kersey in the Covell County Police Training Program. When asked to provide your badge number, how were you instructed to respond? The question, deceptively simple, struck a nerve untouched throughout the case. Kersey paused, then raised his head. He forced a slight smile and scratched the bridge of his nose. Your Honor, depending on field conditions, officers are allowed discretion in deciding when it's necessary to— That's not what I asked. Whitlow interrupted, eyes locked on Kersey's slowly tightening expression. I'm asking about training. Kersey fell silent. He turned toward the attorney, seated behind him, as if searching for a lifeline, but no help came. Cross remained motionless. No defense, no unnecessary gestures. His eyes faced the bench, steady, quiet, devoid of bitterness or sarcasm. He wasn't here for acknowledgement, he was here for what was owed. Whitlow turned the first page of the file, gripping the spine. After a pause, he read each word deliberately, eyes on the paper. After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and related documents, I conclude that the arrest of citizen Nathaniel Cross lacked legal grounds and violated federal authority. He looked up, gaze fixed on the prosecutor's table. I recommend transferring all materials to the State Bureau of Investigation for further review of potential abuse of authority during Officer Logan Kersey's conduct. The room froze. No murmurs, no shifting. Everyone understood that this decision reached beyond one man. It marked something else, the boundary between two institutions that had long coexisted, rarely colliding in open court. Whitlow closed the file. All charges against Lieutenant General Nathaniel Cross are hereby dismissed. This court is adjourned. He rose from the bench without glancing at anyone, but as he passed Cross, his gaze halted. That look carried the weight of gratitude, the haze of repentance, and no hint of theatricality. In the hallway, a few people passed Cross without a word. No one hailed him as a hero, but no one looked at him as a criminal either. Their eyes flickered, uncertain, and they quickly looked away. On a bench near the courthouse entrance, Whitlow stood still. His hand brushed the lapel where his badge used to sit, etched with name and rank. He straightened his back, not for any onlooker, but as if reminding himself of something almost forgotten. The following morning, the first statement from the state prosecutor's office was brief, but its impact stirred the entire local law enforcement system. The agency officially confirmed the launch of an investigation into Officer Logan Kersey, suspected of violating federal citizen arrest protocol under Article 412B. Though the statement did not name Cross or emphasize his military status, it was clear to anyone reading that the matter had grown far beyond a small-town incident. Within police ranks, the reaction spread faster than expected. One group stood loyal to Kersey, insisting his actions were instinctual under field pressure, arguing that a uniform doesn't grant special privileges. The opposing group, mostly young officers and active-duty veterans, began re-examining the vague transfer orders tied to his name over the years. Reports previously shelved due to lack of evidence resurfaced, and witnesses who had once withdrawn began to seem less isolated. Forgotten case files were pulled from storage, as if someone had been waiting for this exact moment to clear the dust. Across local media, from midday bulletins to late-night commentary, the case quickly became a focal point. A headline originating from WCTL radio echoed in cafes throughout the region. The thin line between military discipline and local authority. The host emphasized that this was no longer just a personal conflict between a police officer and a serviceman, but a test for the entire system in confronting its own error, regardless of their source. Meanwhile, a phone call was placed from the office of George Kersey, Logan's father, a wealthy businessman and principal donor to Whitlow's re-election campaign. The contents of the call remained undisclosed, but several sources confirmed that Kersey's voice was cold and direct. Whitlow listened without recording, without interrupting, without promises. The call ended after 3 minutes. He stared out the window for a long time, one hand resting on the desk, as if pressing something down inside himself. Ariel Torres, the public defender who had stood beside Cross during the initial hearing, chose a different path. While most of her colleagues stayed silent, she began collecting internal documents, comparing statements and timestamps. Minor details, such as the moment a report was edited or mistimed facts, slowly connected like puzzle pieces in a game of patient strategy. She didn't post online or publish blog entries. Instead, she contacted an old friend, a freelance journalist known for exposing silenced abuse of power cases. Her first message was just one sentence: "I think this one is real." Curtis Hall, who submitted the original video before being placed on leave, stayed out of the spotlight. He gave no interviews. His social media updated once in 2 days, an image of the police department's emblem against a black background with the caption, "I recorded it because I believe in honor, not in rank. Cross made no public statements. The media referred to him as the silent figure, the man who didn't retaliate, calm in the eye of the storm. After leaving court, he returned to base, never stepping before a camera. The whole town shifted, its every corner stretched by opinions, interests, and prejudice. Yet through all the noise, Cross remained the only constant, silent and intact, like the shadow of a principle long neglected. The corridor leading to the front doors of the Covell County Courthouse wasn't as noisy as on the first hearing day, but the weight of cameras, microphones, and waiting reporters made the air heavier. Nathaniel Cross stepped out, shoulders squared, gaze focused. Voices called his name, asking how he felt, whether this was a victory over the system, what came next. He paused. The moment wasn't long, but enough for all recording devices to capture. Cross looked toward the crowd, didn't avert his eyes, then spoke in a low, steady tone. "I don't need to win. I need the truth to exist, even if only for a few minutes." He offered no further explanation, no drama. The words dropped into the crowd like a small stone hitting still water, not shattering it, only sending out ripples. Within hours, an image of Cross in his Class A uniform, accompanied by that quote, appeared on a black background with white text. No logo, no attribution. Social media spread it without needing sources, as if an unseen force had decided the statement would not be forgotten. In a world where speech often cuts both ways, those words became a shield, not to protect the speaker, but something rarer, lingering belief. Public opinion split quickly. One half viewed him as a rare symbol of dignity and composure in a chaotic era. They wrote that Cross stood for those who chose to keep their honor even when no applause followed. The other half dug deeper, hunting political links, speculating on military motives, even casting doubt on his past. Cross never responded. He had said what needed to be said. The rest no longer belonged to him. 2 days later, he returned to base. No photographers, no press conference, just a short unit meeting held per regulation. When he entered the briefing room, everyone stood. No applause. A young soldier in the front row saluted by the book, eyes locked, unblinking. Cross returned the salute and walked toward his seat as if he had never been away. Elsewhere in the city, Ariel Torres received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a printed copy of Cross's quote, along with an old military ID, worn and shipped. On the back of the page, a handwritten note in blue ink, slanted like from an older hand, read, "If ever you need to remind yourself to stay silent, remember, silence is never surrender." She read it again and again, before placing everything into a drawer. She told no one. She didn't send it back. In her heart, a promise took shape, not from the writer, but from the mere existence of what the world had begun to overlook. Cross no longer appeared in the news. His image faded from headlines. But somewhere, in diner conversations or quiet meetings among veterans, that sentence still returned. A reminder that honor doesn't need to be paraded or protected. It lives because some have carried it without ever selling it. The Covell County Courthouse lobby grew unnaturally silent after the judge declared the arrest legally unfounded. Reporters stood behind the glass, peering in, but no one stepped out from the central corridor. A few spectators quietly left the gallery, yet Ariel remained rooted in place, arms holding an open file she had not yet closed. Nathaniel Cross was the last to leave the courtroom. His Class A uniform fell into place with every deliberate step. His face bore no relief, no triumph, just a familiar stillness, as if everything had unfolded exactly as he had anticipated. As he passed Ariel, he paused for half a second. From his left pocket, he withdrew a small object wrapped in worn blue cloth and placed it in her hand, with a gesture so quiet it was nearly invisible. Ariel glanced at the object, her fingers gently unfolding the fabric. Inside was a weathered silver tag, rectangular in shape, with a dent on one corner. Under the fluorescent lights, It gleamed coldly. The engraving stood out with striking clarity. A soldier does not bow except before the flag or a comrade's grave. Her heart skipped a beat. Her hand froze for a moment. This wasn't a simple military memento, nor a casual keepsake engraved on a whim. The scratches, the worn edges, the weight of it all pointed to something carried over a long, enduring journey, perhaps an entire military career. She looked up to ask something, but Cross had already turned. He did not look back nor offer explanation. His stride remained steady, shoulders square, spine like a pillar embedded in the floor. Ariel watched him fade beyond the courtroom doors. Among all the transcripts, evidence files, and legal documents she had reviewed, nothing had ever weighed on her as heavily as this moment. A piece of metal barely weighing a few ounces carried more force than any argument she had ever heard in court. Throughout her career, Ariel had heard dozens of eloquent speeches, but it was this man's silence and the small object now resting in her palm that arrested her. It was not just a slogan. It was a creed carried through battles, through the long wear of uniformed days, and through courtrooms where dignity was tested quietly, hour by hour. People often leave behind many words after a victory or a legal reversal. Cross left none. No anger, no justification. He simply passed on what he had kept close to his heart for decades, as if to say, "I do not need defense. I need you to remember this." Ariel slipped the tag into the inner pocket of her coat, her hand still trembling faintly. In that instant, she understood that some truths endure without needing to be proven, that some people live by unwritten principles, and that some gifts carry no explanation, because they are declarations in themselves. A small object, a heavy message, leaving behind a presence not easily put away. She placed the silver tag on the page of an old notary journal, the yellowed paper and smudged ink along the edge forming a natural backdrop. She took a photo with her phone. No filters, no edits. Light streamed from a nearby window across the metal surface, highlighting the scratches and engraved text. She posted it to her personal social media with a brief caption. "He didn't ask to be understood. He left this." Within 6 hours, the photo spread faster than expected. The hashtag #NeverBow began appearing across platforms, first shared by those who had followed Cross's case, then picked up by veterans groups, law students, and military justice advocates. Each repost came with its own story, one about a grandfather forced out of service for refusing an immoral order, another about a retired teacher who once said, "You only know what honor means when you almost lose it." In another state, a group of retired officers held a quiet gathering at the monument to the unknown soldier. Wearing old uniforms, they carried engraved replicas of the silver tag left by Cross. A photo was taken and shared with a caption, "We never forgot. We were just waiting for someone to remind us." Media outlets began to take notice. Several news channels explored the angle of the soldier who said nothing but left behind what couldn't be denied. Commentators compared the image to silent justice movements that had long smoldered within the system. They called the tag the final message of a general who did not argue with words. Major outlets reached out to Ariel for interviews. She declined them all. She didn't want to turn it into a trend. She only wanted people to read the words with their own eyes. At a high school in Jefferson County, a literature teacher assigned an essay on the quote engraved on the tag. One student wrote, "I never thought about honor until I understood that sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps you from being crushed." A law professor at Montgomery University used the phrase as an example in a lecture on public service ethics and asked the class, "Who would be the last person you'd stand beside if everyone else bowed?" A week later, Ariel received a craft envelope with no return address. Inside was an old photograph, faded with time. It showed a group of soldiers standing on red soil, their shadows stretching long under harsh sunlight. At the center stood Cross, then a major, holding the same silver tag, its engraved face turned directly to the camera. She kept the photo in her notebook beside the tag. She didn't know who sent it. She didn't need to. Everything that needed repeating was already etched into that piece of metal. A declaration without justification, without clarification, without performance. The tag was small, but it struck at the exact place. a system once tried to erase. Honor is not granted from above. It is not a reward for obedience. It is something one holds on to, even when the world turns away, even when no one is willing to listen. And sometimes, precisely because the person said nothing more, the message echoes louder. The Colville County Police Department's press briefing room had been hastily set up in the second-floor hall, a space usually reserved for internal meetings. A wrinkled backdrop bearing the national seal was pulled across the wall, with 2 state flags positioned awkwardly behind the podium. Seats reserved for the press were numbered, but several remained empty. Major networks like NBC and WGN were not listed among the attendees, despite having registered in advance. Their absence was unsurprising, as the speaking schedule had been pre-written and the event was strictly limited to the reading of a prepared statement, no questions allowed. Captain Valeria Kemp, known for her appearances in internal reform campaigns, served as the department's official spokesperson. She stepped out with a 3-page printed statement and read it in a steady tone, never breaking pace. The core message was repeated twice. After an internal review, we conclude that this was a technical oversight in assessing the situation on scene. No intentional abuse of authority was detected, and no evidence of discriminatory motive was found. She emphasized misjudgment of the situation as a way to shift accountability from individuals to the system itself, paving the way for a lenient resolution. The word violation was absent. Instead, the incident was referred to as an internal issue requiring procedural review. The statement was crafted to avoid admitting fault, while also not outright dismissing the public backlash growing beyond the department's walls. Kersey was not present. The chair reserved for directly involved parties remained empty, creating a visual gap. Rumors quickly spread after the conference ended. He was being advised by private legal counsel to remain silent and prepare a countersuit in case of criminal charges. The lawyer's name was withheld, but internal sources identified him as someone who had successfully defended 3 officers implicated in a 2018 investigation. Following the event, local media echoed the language of the statement, many quoting verbatim terms like technical oversight and no intentional bias. Editorials were cut short or withheld. Only independent blogs dared to question the legitimacy of the internal review. Meanwhile, larger outlets began probing why they were excluded from attendance, shifting the narrative toward concerns about transparency. On social media, the hashtag #CrossWasRight reemerged with rising intensity. Veteran groups posted images of Cross in his Class A uniform paired with a widely circulated quote, "I don't need to win. I just need the truth to exist, even for a few minutes." Communities that had remained silent during previous incidents now spoke out more forcefully. Public petitions demanding an independent investigation gained thousands of signatures within a day. The governor's office maintained its silence. A spokesperson stated they were monitoring the situation and declined further comment. Political analysts interpreted this as a calculated attempt to contain the controversy rather than confront its root causes, while also avoiding the precedent of military oversight in civilian law enforcement matters. Under the spotlight, the language of the statement sounded measured and controlled. But behind the podium, behind closed doors and late-night faxes, the system was tightening its chains to preserve a structure already shaken the moment Cross's name entered the courtroom. Later that afternoon, before the second shift began, an internal memo was pinned to the Covell Department's bulletin board. In the neatly typed single-page notice, the name Curtis Hall appeared under temporary suspension from duty for unauthorized handling of confidential materials and leaking internal data. For those following the Cross case closely, it wasn't unexpected, but it left a bitter taste for many of the younger officers. Curtis had always been quiet, punctual, meticulous, never once cited in a violation report. He didn't align with cliques or raise his voice. Yet it was his silent action that had forced the entire system to confront a truth it tried to avoid, and that was precisely why he became the first target for disciplinary action. The prosecution's report cited unauthorized duplication and external sharing of unredacted body cam footage. even though that footage was later used to exonerate Cross. In the eyes of the system, what was legally right didn't equate to procedural correctness. Tension thickened within the department. Some junior officers whispered, only to fall silent when walking past the main hallway. They understood the message. Even if Curtis had done the morally right thing, he had violated control boundaries. Few dared to speak in support, fearing public alignment might drag them down. But silence didn't mean agreement. Ariel Torres understood this well. Upon hearing the news of Curtis's indictment, she immediately contacted an independent legal team known for defending whistleblowers in law enforcement. She didn't publicize this move, but filed a formal request for access to all disciplinary meeting records mentioning Curtis. In the document, she cited concerns over a lack of transparency and signs of selective accountability. Though the military remained publicly neutral, signals began to surface. A captain in Cross's unit declined to attend a joint interagency ceremony, citing his unwillingness to stand beside those who cannot distinguish right from wrong. Another source confirmed that a formal letter of protest was being drafted to the state's Department of Justice, citing federal military regulations protecting whistleblowers. Curtis never appeared publicly nor posted anything online, but a handwritten note reached Arieli via a trusted colleague. The ink was fresh, the handwriting slightly slanted, folded into 4 neat squares. It read, "No one taught me how to choose between truth and rules. But if I had to choose, I know I did the right thing." Ariel read the note over and over, folded it again, and placed it into her private case file. She didn't send it nor share it. She kept it as a marker, a reminder that within a tightening system, someone still chose to step out of line, not because they were told to, but because of conscience. Beneath the surface of apparent calm, reactions were spreading like an undertow. Something was beginning to crack from within, not yet loud enough to make noise, but to those who looked closely, it was clear the system was moving to restrain those who embarrassed it, and eventually that embarrassment would grow beyond the reach of any procedure to contain. On his way back from a closed-door hearing at the Pentagon, Colonel Marcus Langley sat quietly in the back of a government vehicle, lightly running his fingers over a thin file marked with a private designation. The hearing had ended like all the others. Polite nods, circular language, and a final conclusion that everything required further review. But Langley knew time was no longer a luxury. He didn't return to his office as scheduled. That evening, he sat alone in his study, opened his personal laptop, and began compiling a list from memory. Names, ranks, demotions, reasons listed in official files, and the real reasons. They all had one thing in common. They had spoken up, and then they were pushed out. The first name Langley underlined was Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wynn. 5 years ago, Wynn had served as an internal affairs coordinator, investigating collaborations between military police and local law enforcement. One of his reports caused upheaval when he dared to conclude that there is evidence of the military disciplinary system being leveraged for unauthorized civilian purposes. 3 months later, Wynn was reassigned to logistics. All access to his prior investigative files was revoked. Langley called Wynn on a Friday afternoon. The conversation was short, without pleasantries. "I need to see you. It's still about that. We're not alone anymore." 2 days later, they met at an old warehouse behind a training field, abandoned for years but still connected to power. 4 others were there, all former officers of mid or high rank, each one reassigned for internal reasons. They didn't shake hands or smile, but their eyes met with a quiet recognition born of shared history. No cameras, no transcripts. Each person recounted cases they had been involved in, either as investigators or as those blocked from doing their jobs. One officer described a soldier who had drugs planted in his car after reporting an unlawful search by county police. Another mentioned a missing recording in which a prosecutor admitted to receiving verbal orders to remove a few names from military jurisdiction. The pattern was clear. The targets were always black service members, or those who refused to sign off on falsified records. The pressure never came from a single individual, but from a coordinated mesh of authorities, local police, prosecutor offices, and at times even military internal affairs. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a system, disguised through procedures and bureaucratic language. Langley listened in silence. At the end, he stood up, looked at the group, and said, "If this is a system, then we have to dismantle it with a system, not just a single rebuttal." No one objected. One of them pulled out an old folder from his pocket, stamped in faded red, "Internal Confidential." The cover listed Franklin County. 3 service members had been disciplined for lack of coordination, yet real documents showed they had filed formal complaints. All 3 vanished from service not long afterward. 2 changed names, 1 disappeared entirely. Langley turned the pages slowly, reading without comment, but his eyes no longer belonged to the present. They were looking far ahead, into a journey he knew could only begin from a place few dared to stand. And in the dim warehouse light, they laid the first stones for a quiet but deliberate counterattack. A message arrived just before dawn from an anonymous address, unsigned, containing only one line: "If he trusts you, meet this person." Below it was a set of coordinates in a remote part of the state, with the brief label, Warehouse 5. Ariel didn't hesitate. After everything, she knew silence was sometimes not fear, but preparation. Inside the abandoned warehouse in the decaying industrial zone, Ariel stepped into a dim room, where Colonel Langley sat across from a dusty wooden table. Their greeting was brief. His eyes were sharp, but not cold. She placed her notebook on the table and opened a map marked with 4 counties: Covell, Franklin, Mosswood, and Tyndale. Her voice was low and firm. "If we want to touch the system, we have to bring the story where it can't be swept off the table." Langley flipped through the pages in silence. Ariel continued, this time not with advice, but with a proposition. "I want to work with an independent team of investigative journalists. They're not tied to the big networks and have covered cases of service members pushed out through administrative orders." Langley remained still. He had reason to be wary. The media had twisted many stories before, turning real people into symbols, then distorting those symbols into tools of propaganda. Ariel didn't let the silence stretch. She added a condition. "We won't name whistleblowers. We're not putting people into the headlines. We're mapping the mechanism, the system, not its survivors." His eyes softened slightly, not out of trust, but because he recognized she wasn't asking for permission. She was entering the fight on her own terms. Their collaboration began that night. The journalists were connected to former officers who had lost internal access, to soldiers stripped of medals for refusing to sign pre-written reports. Old administrative files were unearthed, and every signature, transfer order, and date stamp re-examined. A pattern began to emerge, scattered, repetitive. Across all 4 counties, the same personnel names appeared in multiple cases, the same judge authorizing detentions, the same prosecutor voiding appeals, the same officer filing the reports, separated by time, united by handwriting, by phrasing, by consequence. Black service remembers, removed from the system. When the chart was finally completed, Ariel rolled it out over the wooden table, beneath the flickering yellow light. Langley studied the red ink connections, the arrows pointing to the same repeating titles. In that moment, he no longer saw a warehouse, he saw a campaign map, a silent, relentless campaign. He nodded. For the first time since resigning as a policy advisor, he knew he was right to leave politics. He had to step back to move forward, into what the system had been avoiding. As Ariel gathered the files, Langley said only one thing: "I used to think retreating was failure. Now I see, without strategic retreats, we'll never stand firm enough to step into the places no one else dares to go." That night, they left from opposite directions, with no plans to meet again, but they carried the same resolve, not just to expose a single case, but to dismantle the structure that buried all the stories no one ever wanted told. And this time, they would tell it in a way that couldn't be silent. The Alabama State House Oversight Committee's Investigation Center occupied the 6th floor of an aging administrative building with faded gray walls. Inside a room lined with over 20 computers running nonstop, technician Owen Barnes was reviewing incoming files from the internal data channel. Most were duplicate records from county offices, hearing transcripts, or public complaints. At the bottom of the queue, an untitled file appeared, marked simply with the code CVL 214A. Owen clicked on it. The file contained a video over 40 minutes long. formatted for compatibility with county courthouse surveillance systems. Beneath it was an attached document with no sender name. He adjusted his headset and hit play. The screen showed the Covell County courtroom from a static overhead angle. Inside, a man in a neatly pressed Class A uniform sat upright at the defendant's table. Scattered figures filled the courtroom benches. A steady voice read the court transcript. At the 17th minute, Cross raised his head. His words came clear, unwavering. "I will not sign something that's wrong." Owen leaned closer. The footage continued. At the 26th minute, Judge Whitlow glanced up and looked directly at Cross. For a brief moment, his eyes settled on the insignia pinned to the soldier's chest. That glance weighed heavier than any spoken word. Owen paused the video, bookmarked the section, and triggered an internal alert. Within 5 minutes, 3 individuals arrived, including Senior Legal Coordinator Layla Morton. She reviewed the file, then gestured for the lights to be turned off. The room was lit only by the pale glow of the screen. They rewatched from the beginning. No one spoke until the 30th minute. Layla closed her notebook and looked up. This segment was never in the public transcript. Someone murmured, half to themselves, "Why wasn't this in the original record?" Owen pulled the transmission log. The file originated from a military network, specifically a Fort Jackson relay. It passed through encrypted channels used exclusively for internal training communication. No return address, no sender. But in the notes section of the attached document, a single italicized line stood alone on a blank page. "If we bow, who will stand?" Leela sat still. Outside, light rain began to fall. Each person in the room drifted into their own thoughts. No one asked about the sender. No one requested identity verification. They all understood that sometimes people want only one thing: to have the truth seen without needing to say their name. The video was temporarily stored in a restricted access internal folder. Leela instructed 2 copies to be made, one for the Special Investigations Oversight Board, the other for permanent records. She knew this wasn't just evidence. It was the missing piece of a narrative that had been distorted from the start. No one mentioned media coverage. No one planned a press conference. The silence that remained now carried a different weight, a quiet act of resistance, enough to make the machinery of power pause. A lost recording, an unnamed sender, and a question that didn't need answering, only reading aloud. An emergency session of the State House Oversight Committee convened within 36 hours of verifying the Covell footage. The lead investigator ordered an expansion of oversight to 6 surrounding counties, including several that had previously been flagged in the press for abuse of power but never formally investigated. Archived cases were pulled from storage and reorganized by timeline and behavioral indicators. Covell was no longer an outlier. It had become the first link in a chain. Meanwhile, at Fort Jackson, a lieutenant colonel in charge of internal security received a report from the military network surveillance unit. A file had been transmitted through an encryption path reserved for tactical communication. After hours of review, the conclusion was brief. The signal was verified, but the source device was untraceable. The sender left nothing but a reference to the Covell case and a single question that made the entire system free. Nathaniel Cross attended no meetings. He lived in a small house by a field of wheat turned gold, where the signal was too weak to load even a single image. Ariel had once visited, sitting on a wooden bench in the yard for nearly 2 hours, waiting to see if the front door would open. The house stayed silent. She left a folded note with nothing on it but 2 words, "Thank you." During a guest lecture at the State University Law School, Ariel was asked about that trial, what left the strongest impression on her. She didn't mention the charges or dissect the legal strategy. She said, "Some people don't need to win. They just need others to see who's really losing." A student quoted her, and the words spread across social media. Within hours, Cross's name resurfaced, not as the defiant general headlines once called him, but with a new title, the one who sent the final copy. A former veteran who served in Afghanistan wrote to the House committee. In his letter, he shared how local police had illegally searched his vehicle upon return, but he had stayed silent to protect his unit's reputation. Now he submitted a formal incident report, with supporting evidence and a note. "I don't need compensation, I just need this to be acknowledged." Letters like his began to arrive from elsewhere, not in waves, not loudly, but with a common tone. Silence was giving way to action. An independent journalist published a lengthy essay in a sociology journal titled "The Last Bow is Silence," and from that, everything rises. The piece named no one, pointed fingers at no one, but its prose carried weight. It detailed Whitlow's stare, Cross's refusal to respond, and how a system is forced to examine itself when the applause dies out. There was no press conference. No reporters waited outside homes. No explanations offered. But in the counties under review, internal meetings became more restrained. Orders were no longer signed in haste. Things began to shift, not because someone shouted, but because someone stayed silent at the right moment. And truth, as it always does, found its way into the light. On the official page of the Colville County Police Department, a short post appeared early Monday morning. The title was plain, "An Apology from Officer Logan Kersey." The opening line clarified that the post was made at the officer's personal request and did not represent the department as a whole. The letter itself spanned no more than 4 paragraphs, written in measured language, balancing acknowledgement with an effort to preserve dignity. Kersey stated he may have acted inappropriately in an unclear situation, and that he was sorry if his actions caused distress to those who have served or are serving in the military. He closed by expressing utmost respect for anyone who has ever worn the uniform. The post was quickly shared across local news outlets. One online publication highlighted it with the headline, "An Officer Apologizes to a General, a Sign of Change." Many comments expressed support, praising the courage to issue a public apology and noting that everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone dares to admit them. Some called Kersey a model of self-reflection within law enforcement. Alongside this wave of sympathy, a different layer of public response began to emerge. Those who had closely followed Cross's case pointed out that the letter made no mention of legal accountability and failed to admit any abuse of power or lack of procedural transparency. On social media, sarcastic posts began to circulate. "An apology doesn't unlock handcuffs," or "Thank you for calling us distressed instead of victim." One widely shared article noted, "This letter wasn't written to tell the truth, it was written to protect a place in the system." Kersey had not appeared in public since issuing the apology. No video statement, no press interviews. Police leadership confirmed he was cooperating with an internal investigation and would not comment further until a conclusion was reached. Still, this didn't stop sympathetic media outlets from promoting an image of him as a man seeking redemption. Some pundits called his actions brave under media pressure, casting him as a figure of reform. One even described him as a role model for officers trying to recover the ethical foundation of the profession. His brother, public opinion began to shift. Those asking questions were labeled as extreme, disruptive, lacking forgiveness. Those who remained silent were praised for preserving necessary stability. In local community groups, posts mentioning Cross were no longer featured prominently. What had once ignited outrage now fell behind headlines about the weather, food prices, and annual cultural events. A lingering question was slowly buried beneath the canopy of temporary calm. If an apology is not born from understanding, is it really an apology? In Colville, mornings continued as usual, but a part of society had grown weary of truths that were never allowed to age, and in that fatigue, the distance between what is right and what is convenient seemed to narrow. Articles that once placed Nathaniel Cross in their headlines were now archived. The algorithms of social platforms, driven by engagement and hot content, pushed his story further down the feed. Videos that had once gone viral were now buried beneath clips of entertainment, personal scandals, and breaking news from other states. Search terms like Colville, arrested soldier, or the last copy sharply declined, as if the collective memory had closed a chapter never fully read. Several schools that had once invited Ariely Torres to speak on civil rights and legal ethics quietly canceled their events, citing internal scheduling changes. A television station that had expressed interest in hosting her for a live discussion later sent a vague notice saying, "The current climate is not suitable for continuing with a singular narrative." Ariel did not respond. She filed away the documents, moved on to other public defense cases, but her eyes grew heavier whenever someone asked about the old general who had sat silently through a trial. Cross's house remained closed. Some came out of curiosity, others out of admiration, a few because of a line they had read in the final transcript. They stood quietly at the gate, waited, then left with quiet steps. No one saw Cross appear. The fence still bore the color of aged wood. The windows were covered with pale curtains. There was no message of refusal, no sign of welcome. On a state radio program, a debate aired. "Is the public overreacting to an isolated incident?" the host asked. "If the officer has apologized, why are we still pressing forward?" A guest, a former legal advisor, argued that revisiting an event after an apology could erode society's ability to forgive. The discussion ended with a neutral statement. Justice, too, needs space to conclude. Ariel submitted a short piece to a legal journal, omitting names and attention-grabbing phrases. She wrote, "A real apology does not fear questions. It stands on truth, not public approval." The article was placed in the commentary section, barely noticed, but those who read it lingered on the final paragraph. When a major wildfire broke out in a neighboring county, media outlets immediately shifted focus. Every newscast opened with images of firefighters, burning homes, and evacuated families. The once fiery comments demanding justice quieted down. People who had once shared photos of Cross returned to everyday stories. It seemed the collective memory had opened a new file, one lighter, easier to digest. In this society, the truth is not always preserved by law. It survives in the memory of the crowd, and that memory, far too often, retains just enough to avoid feeling indifferent, then moves on as if it never paused. The story of Cross remains intact, silent, but few still stop to turn its pages again. A week after the hearing, news channels that had once covered every detail of Lieutenant General Nathaniel Cross's case abruptly shifted focus. Anchors who once competed to analyze his story fell silent. There was no final report, no formal conclusion. His name vanished from search rankings, and comment sections under related posts were hidden or closed for community standards violations. On television, investigative segments reverted to familiar topics like the local economy, urban traffic, and state-level entertainment. The contrast was stark. Just days before, Cross's silver service tag had appeared on every platform. Now, that same image was labeled controversial content. Users sharing it began receiving warnings from social networks. Some accounts were temporarily restricted. Ariel Torres, the attorney who had represented Cross in court, published a heartfelt post linking to footage from the trial. Within 30 minutes, the post was flagged as unverified. Shares declined rapidly, and comments disappeared line by line. Public opinion splits along a clear line. One side still viewed Cross as a symbol of dignity and resilience. They printed shirts bearing his quote and erected signs in front of churches and schools. The other called him a man who disrespected the police and a spark for civil defiance. Online forums are filled with skeptical remarks questioning what was really behind that 2-star rank. Old records were dredged up, embellished with unverified detail. Cross remained unchanged from beginning to end. He declined all media interviews and never joined any panels on law enforcement reform. When a senator who had once expressed public support sent him a thank you letter, he returned it. On the envelope, he wrote 6 words: "I didn't do it for gratitude." The gesture stunned political circles, but also offered them relief. No one had to keep confronting inconvenient truths. Curtis Hall, the young officer who had secretly backed up the original body cam footage, remained suspended. The internal record stated he was awaiting review for interference with classified material. All of his appeals went unanswered. The HR department kept redirecting calls. He survived off savings from his service days, renting a small room on the outskirts of town and teaching communication skills to civilian recruits entering law enforcement. He never spoke of the incident in class, but every student noticed the solemn look behind his glasses. Somewhere in the city, those who once stood by Cross fell silent, not because their faith had faltered, but because they understood the system didn't need to destroy a symbol. It only needed him to forget. The truth didn't have to be silenced. It just needed to be no longer spoken of. And so, piece by piece, the case vanished from news feeds, facts were cut from footage, and names disappeared from files. Public interest faded not because it found closure, but because it grew weary. That exhaustion was precisely what the system required. And once it had it, Cross, the man who once shook the courtroom, became a blank space no one was obligated to fill. A letter bearing the red seal of the Department of Defense arrived at Ariel Torres's public inbox. Inside was an official offer inviting her to join a newly formed legal advisory team, tasked with handling cases involving violations of service members' rights during civilian operations. The invitation came directly from Colonel Marcus Langley, the man who had appeared at Cross's trial and tipped the scales of power. Ariel read the letter again and again in her small apartment flooded with morning light. The wording was formal, almost deferential. They described her as a legal figure of consistent ideals and ethics, someone aligned with the mission of defending the honor of military personnel. She knew what those words meant. It could be a real opportunity, or it could be a velvet collar quietly fastened around the neck of someone recently freed from public controversy. Langley hadn't included a note, but his name, printed in bold at the bottom with a heavy pen stroke, felt like either a warning or a promise yet to be spoken. She folded the letter, placed it beside her coffee maker, and let her gaze drift to the wall, where a courtroom photo hung. Cross, walking past with his back straight, his eyes holding no conquest, only the resolve of a man who had long ago chosen his side. She messaged Curtis Hall. They met at noon in a quiet cafe tucked into a seldom visited part of town. Curtis wore a dark shirt, his hair cut short, his face pale but his eyes still clear. He smiled when she mentioned the Defense Department's offer. "If you go in, don't sign anything too quickly," he said softly, stirring his coffee. "They always start with beautiful words and lots of frosted glass walls." That line echoed in her mind as she returned home. On her desk was an unmarked envelope, sealed and tucked between two law books. She opened it. An old complaint form fell out, the paper yellowed with age. The header listed the date, 1997. The reason, unlawful arrest, excessive force during a street stop in Monroe County. The witness section bore the name Nathaniel Cross, back when he had no rank, no title, no engraved tag. There was no processing stamp, no agency response. A case, once filed, erased from official records. Erario held the document, eyes scanning the stark, deliberate handwriting. Something in its tone made her believe the writer truly thought the system would answer, but no one ever did. She sat in silence beside the slightly opened window. Outside, people passed by, unaware of how many complaints had been torn, how many witnesses had been erased. In her mind came a single question: do I have what it takes to enter that place, not to speak, but to hear every silence that has never been heard? It felt like a door slightly ajar. It could lead to light inside, or to a dense darkness no one had dared walk into. And in between stood Ariel, the one who had to choose. Some paths came as rewards. The rest were the final test, to see who had the strength to keep walking, even when no one was waiting at the end. The third-floor conference room of the State Executive Oversight Committee kept its familiar gray tones. Glass-covered wooden tables, dark leather chairs, and a clean audio setup at every delegate's seat. Screens lit up simultaneously, displaying a report titled "Deviation in Local Law Enforcement Protocols." A young specialist stood at the podium, speaking in a steady voice as he guided the room through statistics from over 20 incidents in the past 18 months. When the section Case CV Delta 21 appeared, the room fell completely silent. A 15-second body cam clip played. A man stood upright, hands cuffed behind his back, head held high, and asked clearly, "What's your badge number?" No answer came. Moments later, the cuffs tightened, and the screen went dark as he was shoved into a vehicle. The presenter moved on without pause. This illustrates a clear violation of lawful authority. The subject was an active federal operative under the protection of Clause 1012, Section 3. Yet, the behavior from enforcement showed procedural and communicative misconduct. No name, age, or agency was mentioned. The report simply read, 21 CV Delta Procedural Breach Analysis involving defense personnel. No one interrupted. A few exchanged glances, but not a word was said. As the session prepared to move forward, a soft knock echoed from a microphone. A senior legislator, silver hair brushing his collar, turned a page slowly and looked up. His voice was deep and calm. "May I ask, General Cross, the man in the video, where is he now?" The question stopped the room. No one responded. The codes, graphs, and titles suddenly seemed small beside that single name spoken with unsettling clarity. The man in the video was no longer a subject. That question tore through the sterile language. The room could no longer remain detached. The presenter flipped his documents nervously, his hand damp with sweat. A committee assistant leaned in and spoke quickly into the mic. "Individual names fall outside the scope of this hearing per regulation." The words came down like a steel shutter, cold, procedural, but they couldn't hide the unease spreading through the room. A younger legislator leaned into his mic, voice precise. "We're here to discuss systems, operational discrepancies, not individual cases." But the older senator did not turn away. He kept his eyes on the large screen where the man's image had faded. No rebuttal followed. No one cut him off. Yet that name, deliberately omitted, had already entered the room like a drop of ink bleeding through clean paper. In many minds, the dusty black SUV returned, parked low to the ground. Then came the image of the man stepping out, standing tall, asking, "What's your badge number?" No shouting, no struggle, just that steady gaze that had seen too much, and yet still demanded respect. His name wasn't in the file, but he was the reason they gathered. The reason sealed data had to be reopened. His name was absent from the transcript, but the integrity he embodied forced the system to see itself, if only for a moment. The question, "Where is he now?" was never removed from the record. No one deleted it. No one dared. It remained, among technical phrasing and policy codes, a deliberate splinter, reminding them someone once forced them to confront the limits of silence. And one day, in another hearing, someone else would ask that same question, not for answers, but to measure whether the system still remembered how to feel shame or had grown comfortable forgetting. The silence that followed wasn't due to a lack of data, but because some people cannot be reduced to numbers. He had stood there. He had stood tall, and he had made an entire room stop. His name wasn't read aloud, but everyone heard it. In that brief moment, the truth didn't need confirmation. It only needed someone willing to remember. Sunlight slanted through the branches of an old oak tree, casting light on the backyard where Nathaniel Cross was bent over a small garden. The soil here was softer than the hilltops where he had once been stationed, but the breeze still carried a trace of southern salt, mingling with the scent of freshly budding lavender. His worn leather gloves clung tightly to his hands, every motion of planting and patting down the earth deliberate, precise. A slightly rusted iron spade lay beside a bin of homemade compost. Nearby, a gray ceramic teapot leaned toward the sun, its warm body releasing faint wisps of steam. Birdsong floated along the old wooden fence, but it was the phone ringing inside that pierced the quiet. Cross didn't turn around. The ringing paused, resumed, paused again. More calls followed. The voicemail box had long been full, but messages kept arriving, repeating similar phrases: invitations to special interviews, requests to speak at veteran gatherings, offers to share your story to inspire the next generation. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and brushed dirt from his pant knees. Walking toward the tea table, he poured a cup and sat on the old wooden chair under the porch. From here, he could see the lavender rose had all grown their branches. Beside them, the rosemary beds exuded a sharp, clean aroma. The air was pure and still, like a painting awaiting its final stroke. He stood and entered the small wooden house, opening a low cabinet at the end of the hallway. Inside a wooden box, he retrieved a thick jacket, neatly pressed with sharp creases at the shoulders. He folded it, placed it next to a nameplate, a small golden badge, and a silver tag slightly worn at the edges. Cross sat down, gazed at the items for a few minutes, then closed the lid. The light outside had shifted, falling across the wooden table where his tea still steamed. In the garden, a stray cat crept along the fence, silent, just like the way he had chosen to walk away from it all. Some victories didn't need fanfare, and some refusals to be interviewed could echo louder than any televised speech. He placed the wooden box on a high shelf, unlocked, uncovered. He didn't notify anyone. No words of gratitude were needed. For him, honor was not something to be validated by others. It was the only thing he had kept intact. On the silver tag inside, the old inscription remained, as vivid as if etched daily into memory. A soldier does not bow, except to the flag or a comrade's grave. Cross returned to the garden, planted another lavender stalk into a bare patch. He didn't look up when the wind brushed his shoulder, but deep down he knew the sky was wide enough for a man to walk upright without needing victory. Curtis Hall stepped into the second-floor apartment where light streamed through sheer curtains onto an old wooden table. The mailbox downstairs was empty except for one package without a sender's name, a brown paper parcel, no logos, no return address, just a handwritten label with his name, the ink slightly smudged. He placed it on the table, sat down, and carefully cut the edges open. Inside, wrapped in thin gray cloth, was a silver item, cold and heavy. The metal fit neatly into his palm, the surface lightly scratched, the edges roughly finished. It looked hastily engraved, or perhaps crafted by someone used to military tools, unconcerned with polish. Under the soft yellow light, the old inscription appeared clearly. A soldier does not bow, except to the flag or a comrade's grave. Just below it, a new line slanted along the lower edge. Keep to remind yourself, silence can be defiance if it comes at the right time. Curtis sat still, hands cupped around the object as if holding a heavy secret. His eyes traced the engraving, each rugged line like the calluses on Cross's hands that day. There were no invitations, no gratitude, no pressure, no praise. Just something sent at the precise moment when he thought he had nothing left. Beside him lay a resignation letter, still in the unsealed envelope. He had written it 3 days earlier after being notified of indefinite suspension. Part of it was fatigue, the rest confusion about where he belonged. But now that letter felt like a memory urging him forward. He picked it up, read a few lines again, then tore it in half. The fragments fell to the floor as softly as ash. Curtis stood, opened his laptop. His fingers typed steadily, this time drafting a completely different document. Title: Request to initiate an independent investigation into abuse of power and internal collusion at the Covell County Police Department. The recipient address was the Alabama State Civil Rights Investigation Office. No complaints, no resume, no explanation for his suspension, just a preliminary report, attached with the original video clip he had saved, and a list of 4 closed cases he had quietly archived on his personal drive. He saved it, printed 2 copies, and placed them side by side on the table. Next to them was his old police ID card, the text faded, face down. The silver tag lay on top, catching a slant of light from the window. Its engraved lines reflected a message more enduring than any speech the media might quote, a declaration that didn't need applause or engraving on stone. Curtis remained seated, fingers resting loosely on the tag. A breeze drifted through the window, scattering paper scraps into the light. In a world where voices are often drowned out by power, There are moments when well-timed silence becomes the loudest act of resistance a person can choose to begin. The story of Lieutenant General Nathaniel Cross is more than just a case of wrongful arrest. It's a wake-up call about prejudice, power, and the kind of silence that protects corruption. Officer Logan Kersey thought he was dealing with just another old black man too weak to fight back, but he was wrong. Behind Cross's quiet demeanor stood a lifetime of service, discipline, and honor, values Kersey would never understand, let alone respect. All it took was one simple question. Badge number, Sergeant. That was the turning point. Because when dignity speaks, those who misuse power tend to panic. Have you ever been misjudged just because someone didn't truly see you? Have you ever been underestimated, only to prove quietly but undeniably that you were far more capable than they imagine? Never let someone else define your worth based on assumptions or appearances. Silence doesn't always mean surrender, and sometimes the most powerful truth comes from the ones who never raise their voice. If this story made you think, share it so others can reflect too. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life stories that expose what's broken and honor those who stand tall anyway.